We received many results of recent reports that have come out as recently as this week, and a little more historical perspective on where women stand in terms of economic improvement. So thank you for that. It really frames the day for us, because as she mentioned, as you go through the day, there will be several panels that touch upon the things that Milan has mentioned. We have a panel for you on corporate board specifically. We also have a panel on general women's leadership that includes women from many different disciplines and areas of the workforce. And then we have speakers later this afternoon that will touch upon additional topics. So thank you. It really does give us a frame of reference. I do have questions for you about strategies for getting us from where we are now to where we'd like us to be, that I will get to. I guess I first would like to, I think the audience would like to hear a little bit about your own path. You've held many fascinating positions, as we've heard. And if you could just share a little bit with the audience about where you started and how you got to where you are.
Well, I started here at Georgetown, so it's a good place to begin. And for those of you not from Georgetown, who knows, you may wind up here at some point yourself. But all kidding aside, I think one of the things that, at the perspective that I have at this stage in my life from where most of you sit, is this hope that you will go from where you are today in your dreams to the realization of those dreams. But as those of us who are a little older will tell you, it's not usually a straight trajectory. And I think one of the things always that is most important is to hold on to those things that you care most about, what makes you most excited, where do your passions lie, what do you want to do with your life, and be available to the kinds of opportunities that that present themselves as they will, many of which are totally unpredictable. If anybody told me when I was sitting at Georgetown in Gaston or wherever else that one day I would be the first ambassador for global women's issues, I would tell them they were drinking something in excess because it was unimaginable. I spent most of my time, not in business when I was at Georgetown, but in Russian studies. And, you know, I wanted to make a contribution. I was passionate about politics and current events. It was a time when we had a young president who was making all of us feel we did want to give back in some way to our country. And moving forward as opportunities presented themselves, I think, was the key. And it was a very kind of, in my case anyway, a very jagged, not a straight line, but a jagged line. You know, I remember I went to high school in New York, to a boarding school, and my great dream, going to the United Nations as much as I could, was to be an interpreter, because that's the only role I saw women in those days. And I think today, one of the big changes is the modeling of women in every position. The head of the IMF, you know, secretaries of state, heads of countries, CEOs of companies. There are 3 of the major defense contractors, the biggest defense companies today, are women. I think that is unheard of in terms of yesterday. These are the changes that you are part of. And the lesson I would take, whether it's Norian or myself or any of the rest of us, what you could take from that is get the single best education you can, get as many experiences as you can in the things that you're interested in, and then really go with what you care about most. What are you most interested in? Whether it's marketing or it has to do with international business in a significant way, but make yourself available to the opportunities as you go forward.
We talk a lot about, with our students, about following your passion and being dedicated, giving it your all, regardless of what your choice of study is, so thank you for that. I also heard you talk about taking risks, Life is full of uncertainty. It's unpredictable. So certainly there's a measure of risk that one needs to take that is, I think, not always easy to make the hard choices. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your role and your founding of Vital Voices, because I'm not sure, I think it's a tremendous organization, and I'm not sure that everyone in the audience is completely familiar with the great work that they do.
One of the things that I did in the White House with the then First Lady is to work with women around the world. And that didn't come just because we were sitting around one day saying, well, what should the First Lady's priority be? She should get involved in global affairs and really focus on women. It wasn't that way at all. And it was really an evolution, both for her and certainly for me. And one of those pivotal moments in those White House years was when she went to the 4th World Conference that the United Nations sponsored, that took place in Beijing. And it was a coming together of women representatives from all the governments, not just women, men and women, but it was a women's conference. And then thousands and thousands of other women gathered, many from the United States, in another part of China, focused mostly from NGOs, really focused on the agenda. And the agenda was, how can women advance? What do we need to do? And it covered a platform for action that was about girls' education, access to health, economic participation, being significant actors in security issues in times of conflict, etc. It's a blueprint that many governments still measure themselves against, and certainly leaders in the women's movement do. And when the First Lady went to Beijing, it was controversial. The right wing said that the conference was going to create 5 genders. I don't know what those genders were, but that was a big issue. The left wing said, no, you can't go to China. They're human rights violators, and you would just essentially validate the behavior of China. Well, that wasn't the case either. It was a conference, an international conference, that happened to be held in China. So we were trying to, sort of overcome all of these obstacles just to get there. And what came out of that, unfortunately, most of you were too young to be aware, but you can read about it, was one of the historic speeches, I think, of our time on these issues, where the First Lady of the United States said, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. Now that seems like a no-brainer, right? Women are human. Women's rights are human rights. But far too often, and it is still the case in many ways, women's rights are relegated to the margins. They are seen as a subset of human rights, as something separate from human rights. And that is not the case, obviously. And what she did, and out of the conference came a chiseling of these rights in international law, but she went through a litany of what is happening to women around the world, from honor killings to trafficking, to some of the most egregious things that you read about in all of the headlines today. And after delineating each one of these, she would say, this is a violation of human rights. And this cavernous room, I don't know how many times bigger than this, all of a sudden, as she would mention dowry burnings, you would see a whole bunch of people stand up. And usually at these conferences, nobody does anything but perfunctorily applause at the end. There's no emotion that's ever demonstrated. You think maybe they're asleep. But all of a sudden, these people were rising on their feet, and they were obviously mostly the women who were struggling every day with these horrific problems, and nobody was paying attention. And so one after another was on their feet. They start pounding the desks in front of them till the whole room erupted in massive applause. And it was this moment where you understood, in some ways, the value of America's leadership, the value of leadership, that here were people from all over the world who were who were so pleased and overwhelmed by the fact that somebody important would come by virtue of being married to the President of the United States and say the things that they had long wanted to see addressed. And after that, Mrs. Clinton spent a lot of time on domestic issues, to be sure, but she spent enormous amounts of time also on raising up these women's issues. We traveled to some 60 or 70 countries. We always met with the women. It's amazing how much you learn when the doors are closed and they tell you exactly what's going on. Spotlighted the programs that are making a difference. And the State Department had a program called the Vital Voices Democracy Initiative. And this is a time when the world is changing. You know, when I was here at Georgetown, we were fighting communism. It was the free world against totalitarianism. And this was a huge, huge polarity in the world. And all of a sudden, the walls were tumbling down, and the world was changing. Market economies were being created where there had only been command economies. Democracies were being created where there were communist governments. And women needed to be at the table. How is this transition going to happen? Look at Egypt today or Tunisia. How is this transition going to happen if half the population, not a special interest group, half the populations of those countries were not engaged? And so what this initiative did wasn't a lot of government money. It was people like the professional women who are the leaders in the business school, for example, volunteering to transfer business skills to women in different parts of the world, in the former Soviet Union, in Africa, and other places. Communication skills, advocacy skills, building the capacity of these people, many of whom were PhDs, many of whom were lawyers, but they had no experience in this new world. And they needed to be effective, not just get to the table, but be effective at the table. And that's when it really became crystal clear in every one of these programs. It really matters to invest in emerging women leaders. Because if you invest in the emerging leaders, they in turn will pay it forward and invest in others. And you will grow this network across borders. And they are the vital voices of our times because they are the ones on the front lines of change all around the world. So when the administration was ending, it wasn't so much people in government, but the people outside of government who had been very active in these initiatives around the world saying, well, what's going to happen? The women around the world were saying, what's going to happen? Those with whom we had worked. And so a decision was made by a number of people, let's make this an NGO. And yours truly somehow wound up saying, okay, let's make a go of it. And this is what's interesting for you all in business. A number of the women who were active with us in other parts of the world were McKinsey girls, I called them. They were young women who were working for McKinsey and Company. They were not always particularly excited about restructuring insurance companies, and they wanted to know what else they could do. And so they got involved in what became a voluntary activity in places from, Latvia to Zimbabwe. And wherever they had offices, many of them became engaged. And when I went to starting Vital Voices, I sat with a group of McKinsey women in Washington, and for the better part of, 6 months or so, we actually addressed every issue. What is your core issue? Where are your supporters going to come from? What is your message going to be? What are you going to be about? All the kinds of things you would do if you were starting a business. And I think in many ways that experience with us led to McKinsey's work with NGOs. It basically created an office within McKinsey that now is a very successful part of their work, which isn't just with the private sector, but is with some of the largest NGOs in the world. So it took, there was a lot of moments when I wasn't sure we were going to make it. Honestly, you talk about taking risk and where the resources were going to come from. But I made a decision from the beginning that these issues were not just about applying for grants from foundations or governmental bodies, but it was really about working also very closely with the private sector. So Vital Voices has always enjoyed an enormous spirit of a cross-sectoral approach to an NGO where there's strong business engagement, strong engagement with a larger number of institutions, and with the government. So, you know, again, it was decided, it was clearly a decision, but it was also unpredictable because I never would have imagined that the work we did in the White House would result in my starting an NGO.
Thank you. And I think the last Vital Voices event had nearly 3,000 people present.
It's become an extremely successful organization.
Yeah.
Because these issues, and you are part of this wave, are really moving, finally, in a way where there's greater recognition that women's participation in all of these ways is absolutely critical.
I would like to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship. It's interesting, I was on the phone this morning at 8 a.m. being interviewed by a reporter from the UK who writes for the Financial Times. And most of his questions were about what makes Georgetown unique, what makes the undergraduate program here distinctive. So I found myself talking a lot about our Entrepreneurship Fellows program. I also found myself talking a lot about the broad skill set that we provide our students, because it's not just about finance and accounting, as you've heard Ambassador Verveer say. It's about being willing to take risks, being creative, being innovative, being able to be persuasive, being able to write a business plan, raise money, and so on. So we started this Entrepreneurship Fellows program 3 years ago, and we've just opened it up now more broadly, where we now accept all undergraduates across the campus. You touched upon entrepreneurship in your opening remarks, the importance of women starting their own firms. We're going to hear later today from a woman who has started one of the few, if not the only, all-female law firms in the country. So she'll be on one of the panels later today. And you touched upon microfinance. In your mind, what are some of either the strategies or economic policies that perhaps might enable, facilitate more women to take that risk?
Well, there's no doubt entrepreneurship is one of the drivers, maybe the critical driver of growth. And we think of big business, and yet in the United States, it's small and medium-sized businesses that are the backbone of our own economy and our own growth, and we hope that growth will build because we are sort of stuck right now. But what is growing are that women-owned businesses are growing at twice the rate of male-owned businesses in the United States.
Thank you. And that actually is a good segue to my last question before we open it up to questions from the audience. And that is that another focus here at Georgetown, and as well at McDonough School of Business, is the global perspective. And we encourage our students, nearly 60% of our students do end up studying abroad, either during the summer or during the semester or for a year-long program. We encourage our students to take a second or a third language, to take as many globally focused courses as possible, as their schedule permits, and then to have some sort of an experience, a real experience. And so I'm wondering, I mean, in threaded throughout your entire opening remarks and then our Q&A during this session has been the realization and focus that it really is a global economy, it's a global society. There are global differences, certainly in how women are treated, and you were just talking about women's ability to start businesses. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the importance of women really understanding the global marketplace, the global economy, the global business world.
Well, I don't think there's a choice today. I think, you know, we're all tied together. And you only have to look at this recent financial crisis that we all went through. It didn't just stay in one country. It grew like Topsy, because today you can't disconnect one market from the other, one country from the other. We're all in this together. And that's why your education here is so valuable. Everything Norian just said, that's part of the business school's ethos in terms of how the environment here is supported, is critically important to each of you as you go forward in this space, this business economic space, because it's no longer what happens just in your town or your community. You know, you may have a nice business, but if the next one is collapsing in some part of the world, it's not likely it's going to do anything but undermine you. You have only to go through some of our cities during the last financial meltdown that we all experienced. We had problems in the United States, to be sure, but those problems were also part of a global problem, with exports and imports being what they are, with dependencies being what they are. What did you see when you went down the streets of many of our cities? You saw closed storefronts. And it wasn't because those proprietors and owners weren't doing a good job in their own way. It was because they became casualties of what was happening in this big global world in which everything was tied together.
I think on that positive note, it's a great way to end our morning session. There will be networking coffee outside the auditorium for about 15 minutes, I believe, 15, 20 minutes. So I think at this point we should give a warm round of applause to Ambassador Verveer.
Well, to all of you.